Okay, so just very quickly, thank you again, everyone, for being here. I'm Charlotte Muken. We're here with the Pelham Arts Center. This is one of a series of events that we're doing this week to support artists, Ukrainian artists, contemporary Ukrainian artists, celebrating some cultural traditions of Ukraine. There's going to be a lot of events happening this week, including tomorrow at the Pelham Arts Center. We're going to be having a lecture and a demo from Sofika about Pisanki and the traditions there. We might hear a little bit about that today as well. And then on Sunday, we're going to have a big cultural celebration with the Cheres ensemble and the performers from the UNA School of Dance. All this information is also on our website, and all these events are free. I also want to say thank you to our grant sponsors, Arts Westchester, Restart the Arts Grant. Some of this programming would not be possible. To our local Pelham Rotary Club for their support of these events. Thank you so much to them. And of course, to New York Council for the Arts, which really helps Pelham Arts Center and so many nonprofits across the state. They're really phenomenal, as many of you know. So that is where I'm at. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with Katrina Majkut today. And again, I said this to the artist before the call. If I mistake names, please just correct me and let's get to it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and I hand it to you, Katrina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here, Charlotte, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm sorry that we were brought here under such intense times with the war going on in Ukraine, but I'm really glad that we could share some of our culture and insight about it with you. So I am located outside of New York City, and I describe myself as an embroidery artist. And what you're going to see on the slideshows, I'm just going to let them run through on their own instead of me going slide by slide. And so there's about 4 different series, and they're all have a common theme that's connected to my heritage. And so what I really want to share with you is that I am born in the US, so my nationality is American, and I am the granddaughter of 4 World War II DPs, displaced persons. And so I am technically 2nd generation, and I really identify a little bit more with 1st generation. So I'm sort of like 1.5 is what I say. And that's because I grew up in the Boston Ukrainian community. All my aunts and uncles are born overseas, and it just happens to be that my parents were the 1st generation born here. And so they were really embedded in the Ukrainian community growing up. And so my experience has been like a very Americanized one. And that has made it pretty hard to find a way to fit into the Ukrainian one. And it has also sort of set me aside from being fully American, I would say, in a way, because I had this very strong cultural touchstone that I was raised to be very passionate about, very protective of. And, in understanding sort of like the history of Ukraine and the politics of group behavior, and the fact that my whole family was trying to fit into the American experience, like I wasn't raised speaking Ukrainian. I wasn't raised in the camps. I did go to church. I didn't grow up to be religious. And so if you don't really fit into Placer Soon, which Andrea will sort of get into later, it's hard to fit in. You're constantly questioning yourself, are you Ukrainian enough? And so when I became an adult, I tried to take it upon myself to become more immersed in it. I took embroidery classes at the Ukrainian Art Museum in New York City for 6 years. And I also attended the Harvard Research Institute to learn Ukrainian, but unfortunately, if you don't use it, you lose it. And, but what I did grow up with, not only was a strong sense of pride and in my culture, was a lot of the traditions, from Pisanki to embroidering, which is a lot to do with why I became an embroidery artist. And in fact, just to show off, this is a vyshyvanka that I stitched myself. It took few years to make. But the one thing that has been difficult to sort of recognize and address as a second generation American is that sort of inheritance of the trauma and of the history of Ukraine. And that was something that my grandparents directly experienced and sort of carried over into my parents' generation. And then what was complicated by that was the fact that they came to America and experienced a very poor, uneducated immigrant experience. And that has had a really profound effect on me as an artist, as a person. You know, and what was difficult to sort of understand with that generational trauma, which this war has sort of brought up, was that in America, none of it is taught. Ukrainian history is not covered in American schools. No one knows what Holodomor is. No one knows what collectivization is. No one understands really the toll of Ukrainian deaths that happened within World War II. I think I remember in high school, it was like a sentence, a sideline note in my history books. And it was always hard getting Americans to sort of understand that there is this inherited experience that goes down the line. And so what gets complicated with adding like an immigrant experience to that is that, so my grandparents came here in the 50s with this idea of the American dream and how anyone can get it. And it's selling this idea of control that these immigrants didn't have in their countries of origin, control over their destiny. It's, you know, it's a manifest destiny concept, the American dream, that you can be in control of your wealth, your body, your destiny, all those things. But what they didn't really sort of explain was that there are provisions to that American dream. They're going to experience barriers because they don't speak the language, because there's discrimination against immigrants, because because of World War II, they pretty much only had a 6th grade education. They're not sold in that package of the American dream. And so I think what I saw growing up was a lot of generational struggle to achieve that dream, maintain that dream, keep that dream. And there was struggle within that. And so as an artist, what I actually thematically do in all my work is address this idea of control. Now, usually because we're in America and I usually address purely American audiences, I'm usually talking about this idea of control within the context of reproductive rights, gender rights, how you can understand how cultural traditions like embroidery, like gender traditions affect civil and social rights. And that's usually what I lecture on. I exhibit at a lot of colleges. And so, but it's entirely connected to my Ukrainian heritage. And so I'm making work that tries to control narrative, control bodily autonomy, control destiny, demanding finding acceptance within controlling groups that try to dictate your future. And I'm also trying to control a medium both conceptually and formally. Embroidery is something that's not really taught in traditional art schools, definitely didn't have an education in it. This is something that was handed down from my mother to me as her mother taught her, both because it's part of a Ukrainian pastime, but also because it is just what women do. This is also part of European and American pastimes within women's domesticity and their sphere. And so, and what's ironic about my conceptual pursuit of control within the artwork that I'm making is the fact that cross stitch does really lend itself to control. You're working with a gridded system. It's all little X's. You usually have a map that you work off of to create your image. And because it allows this creative control, it's usually thought of as a sort of meditative pastime. It's a great way to calm down, cool out. But the irony is that it has also been controlled for centuries by the patriarchy, especially within Western Europe and America. This is one of the things that I talk about in my bigger talks, is just how the Catholic Church, the embroidery guilds, and then the general patriarchy sort of started controlling the motifs of what was permissible for women to stitch. And so what I'm doing as an artist is really trying to challenge those notions of representation within the medium. I'm trying to stitch items that have been excluded from it as a way to control women's identity and to represent more modern values. And so the slides that you've been seeing here are from my series In Control, where I'm trying to stitch every modern product related to reproductive health, family planning, bodily autonomy. And so as I was getting a little bit further onto the series, the subject started getting heavier and heavier, and it started to actually deal with a lot of sexual abuse, rape, that sort of thing. And so I decided that was starting to become its own series. And I still think this is sort of connected in probably a very subconscious way to that violent history that my grandparents came from. That experience in Ukraine wasn't something that they really talked about it because it was so painful, and we had bits and stories. It wasn't something that they willingly wanted to talk about, but we got bits and stories, and it tended to be very violent. There was a lot of conscription into armies, forced labor camps, probably some sexual assaults within there, and prison sentences. And it was very hard. Meanwhile, they had a growing family. There were 4 kids on one side, 6 kids on the other. So the responsibility of managing children on top of the war became exceedingly hard. And then they came to America with basically nothing and had to build a life for themselves despite many disadvantages. And so I think I just want to check, how much time do we have, Charlotte? Oh, so this is the rape kit. It's actually a deconstructed sexual assault kit. It's 13 different pieces all together. And if we go to the next slide, you can see a little bit of, oops, oh, I'm missing it, never mind, sorry. And so, yeah, this is starting to talk about bodily autonomy in a different way, where you get to control what happens to it. And so I started this new series called In Defense, which I started stitching all the different products that are meant to stop sexual and violent assaults, and really sort of started questioning the efficacy of those. They're putting the responsibility of stopping the violence on the survivor of the would-be crime instead of sort of stopping it from the actual source. So sorry, Charlotte, what time do we have?
All right, you're okay. We can go for another minute or two.
Okay. So if we go a little further into this series, I'd like to get to these kits that I have. Yeah, so these are the Stitch and Bitch DIY counted cross stitch kits. And so one of the things that I started learning from doing a lot of the Ukrainian cross stitch and then diving into the history of European cross stitch is the fact that everything's always been dictated to us and what we should stitch. By stitching it, we are adhering to some cultural behaviors that are approved. But it's really exclusionary and it doesn't include diverse voices. So I started making these stitch kits that sort of challenge traditional store kits. And this is really a chance for people to sort of speak their own truths within the kits, things that relate to their own identity, things that aren't represented within the medium. And so this starts to take on a really intersectional aspect to embroidery. And so I think this has a lot to do with the fact that, I've been handed down this tradition because of my heritage and my gender, but I haven't really been given much choice within it. And that, I don't think that's special to me. I think that is something that's a little universal across the board. And so I really wanted to give people a chance to speak their own truths. And then this series called Ballsy, I'm starting to look into sports because this idea of control in terms of your body, your destiny, also really has to do with belief in your own strength. And sports is a really great way to find that. And yet women aren't really accepted within it. There's still a lot of barriers and hurdles. And so I'm starting to explore the meaning of these objects. And this is sort of related to baseball, because who doesn't go to a baseball game and have a beer? But I am exploring these objects that are about Americana, and sort of understanding the social context to each of these that we wouldn't necessarily explore. And this American culture really starts to be embedded in beer advertising and for capitalist means. And that becomes very complicated because the lines between those become blurred. And yeah, so that is the gist of it. I will say that as a Ukrainian-American second generation that has inherited a lot of this sort of the trauma that Ukraine has experienced throughout the different decades. I think what makes being a second generation American really complicated is that I'm a white American. And having had the privilege of being raised as such really kind of starts to put people at odds with this Ukrainian experience that that people are starting to understand. And it's really complicated. I am also still really sort of unpacking how at odds those two seemingly different experiences would be, because this war is really an act of colonialization and imperialism. And we're talking about issues of brutal genocide and violence. And that's not something that is often put into the context of white people's experience. And so when I kind of work as a feminist artist, as an artist that's described as someone who has a social practice or as an art activist, I think people who don't know me and don't know my work can often quickly dismiss it as sort of white feminism. But as you can see in the kits, I'm trying really, really hard to be intersectional, to let people own their own stories, and to be very understanding and sharing of platforms. So yeah, it's great that we've been able to come here and I've been able to share this. And so I look forward to your questions, and thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Katrina. And it really is, it's so interesting to see the way you've taken the story of your heritage and reinterpreted it into these contemporary mediums, dealing with a real spectrum of contemporary issues, from women's issues and race relations. And that's always very exciting for me. And there is a lot of content there, but I do want to hear from all the other artists. So remember, you can put questions in the chat. We will have a question and answer kind of time period at the end. And then Katrina, I know you're also involved with some wonderful things to support Ukraine right now. There's some art auction things available and all sorts of things. So feel free to add those links into the comments as well. So thank you so much. And next we're going to go on to Luba and learn about her work. So Luba Drozd, please correct my pronunciation, please. And
that's perfect. Thank you. Yeah. Hi, I'm Luba. I was born in Ukraine and I moved here when I was 15. Some of my family is in Ukraine or outside of Ukraine at the moment. They got out. I guess I'll just move on to my presentation about my work. Okay, so you can see this, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm gonna read a short statement. It's difficult for me to improvise right now. I work primarily with sound installation. And by sound installation, I mean I work with vibrations and architecture. I don't use speakers. I don't use pre-recorded sound. I don't use transducers. So all the site-specific pieces are produced with vibrations only. So the space and the sculptural elements in my works become the amplifiers, the resonant objects and receivers of 3D animated projections. So another element of my site-specific works are 3D animated projections that further break down and restructure architectural space. Because of architecture and composition of material architecture, I'm able to layer and structure work that is site-specific in a fullest sense. Each corner, wall, pocket of space creates a different microclimate of sound and perception. So I will go through a few of the site-specific pieces that I've done in the past, and just stop me when the 10 minutes is up, because I haven't had time to time the presentation. So, okay. So this is the work that I'm going to present now is called Tarsayan. As all of my works, it's a site-specific installation with 2-channel 3D animated projections, shells, rails, copper piano strings, vellum, steel, glass motors, and Arduino. So I've done a lot of installations in formerly inhabited spaces. So this piece was done at the former Abercrombie & Fitch storage room. So I left some parts of the former storage room and they became part of the installation. Some of them reverberated with vibrations from the motors that are attached to copper piano strings. I also use drywall and glass, kind of like a guitar fret, to modulate sound and vibration. Sometimes I use steel bricks and vellum and other elements like that, and a synchronized 2-channel animation like this. So with each projection, there's a slow animation, usually replicating some elements of the space, such as shadows or position of objects. And the shadows, the 3D animated shadows and objects slowly disappear or grow. So the space changes over time with the animation. Most of the objects in my installations are not attached, so they're precariously propped up. The only things that I attach to walls are copper wound bass piano strings. This is another shot of this piece. So for example, in this shot, a steel plate that's 8x4 is bowing on its own weight and holding a steel brick with the piano string strung across the brick. So the vibration of this piano string, as you can see in this picture, is carries on to this steel sheet and reverberates throughout the space. So the texture of the sound changes through different materials. This is another shot of just a different projection. And here is a little video. So the sound is recorded on site. I didn't do anything to it. That's just organic sound. It may be a little loud, so adjust your speakers. You hear that?
Yes, yes, we can.
So, sorry. So, because the vibrations are everywhere around, and the site specificity of the piece, it's uh, difficult to convey it over the screen and headphones. But when you're in the space, your whole body perceives the sound with your feet and travels through your body as you walk around. So the next work is the aesthetic limits of water. Sorry. There's some, yes, the aesthetic limits of water. So this is a 2-room site-specific installation with 3-channel 3D animated projections, granite, copper, piano, string, steel, drywall, glass, motors, Arduino. And it was conceived in 2020. I actually installed it. My last install day was the day that they declared national emergency. So I installed the piece and it was covered up, and it stood at the Hessel Museum for 8 months before it could be shown. So what inspired me, it was the NASA guide that I saw, and it was a guide about water and NASA's standards about water limits, aesthetic limits of water. What is a good and clean water, and what standards could be used when people are traveling into space. The piece is also inspired by different kind of vessels that contain water. So a lot of animations are based on plastic containers and bottles that contain liquids. And I used CAD graphs from of these containers that I animated and further projected them on pieces of granite. So this is the space before the installation, and this is just to show my process. I 3D print the model of the space, and then I start working with flashlights and map out where things are going to be. So in this image, you can see animated projection. This is an animated projection on granite, a piece of granite that is propping up a piano string. This is one of the rooms of the installation. Some of the projections were on the sheets of steel, and I projected 3D animated versions of the stone. Some of the projections are fake shadows that the steel didn't make, like here, and some of the projections are also, replications of shadows. So this is another shot of this piece with the animated CAD drawings of liquid containers. This is one of the rooms. Just for scale, this is about 6 feet. There's the tall standing thing, if you can see my mouse, 6 feet. And everything, all these piano strings in the piece are vibrating and creating sound composition into rooms. So it's a 2-room sound composition, basically. This is the, it's one of the rooms. And I have another quick video. Sound. Do you have any more time or my?
We've got another 2 minutes or so. If you want to share one more.
Sure. Yeah, I'll go quickly. Okay, thank you. So the same year, 2020, I did this project called Cineris, kind of inspired by Ash. It was a tough year, right, for a lot of people, for me too. So this is a piece, also it's a room site specific installation with ash, granite, copper one piano strings, and 4-channel 3D animated projections. So it doesn't have a video, but I will go through some images quickly. So I used glass again. The piano strings were kind of warping the steel sheets. There was a lot of ash that was when the vibrations hit certain areas of the objects, the ash would start moving, and so there was a microscopic evolution of the installation piece. I reuse some of the elements of previous works, and I grow on that practice. So some of the elements repeat themselves, but some of the elements fall away. So it's kind of growing and evolving. Yeah, and 3D animation usually replicates some of the elements of architecture as well, and slowly animates to create architectural offsets. Shot. So this is
Wow.
sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Oh, so this is one of the ash elements. The metal, standing metal piece would disturb the ash, and the ash would slowly go onto the glass and get off the glass, so slowly evolving. Shot. And here as well, in the beginning of the work, there was nothing here, but it would slowly vibrate. So if you watch it for a while, and that's what I like about my work, is that it's a slow observation. You can spend an hour with a piece and observe little details. It's kind of meditative work. And I think that's it.
Wow. Luba, thank you so much for sharing that. I just learned a lot. I was not very familiar with your work, and I looked on your website and photographs, but I feel like I have such a better understanding of it now. So thank you.
Thank you.
Also, hearing an artist speak about installation specifically is always so helpful because I know often the public can kind of walk in and be like, oh my God, what is this? And hearing you describe it about the intersection of the architecture and hearing the video and the sound is just, it was very exciting for me. So thank you for sharing that. Again, I don't want to open it up to too many question and answers now. I want to make sure everyone has their time to speak, and then we can go more conversationally. So with that said, Christina, would you go ahead and take over for your section? Great, and make sure you're unmuted.
Great. I am a painter, so coming from a much more traditional place than what we just looked at. And I'm going to limit my comments pretty specifically to Ukrainian influences. Like Katya, I too am born in the United States, but first generation born in this country. So my parents came as small children. And I think we're all, when you talk about the epigenetics of the current situation, where we all feel sort of reverberated trauma because our parents and our grandparents experienced situations very similar to what we are seeing play out now. Having said that, what I take away from my Ukrainian experience was having grown up in an entrenched community that was supportive and very rich. So I actually attribute being an artist to that decision was probably made as a small child because I knew artists in my community. They were part of the fabric of all the people that we interacted with. There were doctors, there were lawyers, there were teachers, and there were artists. On Sunday, after we went to church, we would go downtown in Manhattan and go to the Arts and Literature Club and see exhibitions by artists here, artists from Ukraine. And I got to see and interact with them. So as a young person, it was an entirely imaginable pursuit for me, which I think is actually kind of magic. It also is, I come from a very rich tradition in terms of cultural exposure. We all, even if you're not into art, if you're Ukrainian, you were surrounded by it constantly, whether it was the embroideries that we wore. Everybody has hundreds of pillows that our parents had on couches. We have more of them than we want sometimes. There was wood carving. So you really experienced it all around you. Even if you weren't interested in art, you were exposed to it. I'm going to go ahead and share why I have a BFA as well as an MFA. And when I started my training, I was attending Sarah Lawrence College, working in really trying to find my own voice as an artist and figure out what it is that I wanted to do. I was simultaneously had the privilege to study with Petro Holodny, who was one of just a few iconographers who had painted half a dozen churches here on the East Coast, and several which are really beautiful examples of replicas of churches in Ukraine. And he taught me the traditional precepts of iconography, how to make my own pigments, how to make my own gesso, build boards, and all of the precepts and rules. And there are an awful lot of rules about how icons are made. The specific color schemes in terms of the positions of how these figures were portrayed, they were identified. The purpose of these paintings, if you look at early Christianity, people didn't read. So the purpose really was didactic. So you had to be able to identify the players in these respective stories based on the pictures that were in front of you on the walls of the church. Because, you know, in the early days, people didn't read. And those who did read, that's what these inscriptions, these little inscriptions are actually abbreviations. So if you could read, you could figure out who people were. But if you couldn't read, you really needed to be able to identify them based on the specifics of the icon. So as a contemporary artist, and I think this is something that resonates with what Katya was talking about, this idea of being conscripted into you have to produce these paintings this way because these are meant for liturgical use. This is a pair of wedding icons that I did for somebody. But one of the things that you really start to question as a contemporary artist is, okay, this is great, but I don't want to paint paintings that have been done a million times. What am I bringing to it? And that's a very 20th century notion of, you know, the artist's identity in painting. But that was something I definitely started talking about and thinking about. So I started doing contemporary pieces, which were derivative of traditional icons, and really testing the boundaries of what are the things that we can leave out and what are the things that we can keep in. The other thing that I was really fascinated by in icons specifically early on was obviously rich color, brilliant, luminous surfaces, but also the notion of having a transformational experience tied to a work of art. An icon, by definition, is not, and specifically in the Byzantine tradition, was not meant to portray a Madonna or Christ. It was actually to help you peer through and get to another space. That it's, you know, it's tied in many ways, perhaps more closely to the Buddhist thinking of being present. And so that idea, and I remember the moment when I was probably about 18 years old, standing in front of a Rothko painting and having that same sort of feeling that it is completely transformative. And so that was really the sort of crux of what I was after in terms of the experience of being in front of or being with a painting. But I interpreted that very personally in terms of bringing to it the language that I had been exposed to and was definitely part of my heritage. Again, as a contemporary artist, I was starting to explore different materials when I was in graduate school. I've always been fairly 2D and fairly flat. But I started working with other materials. I was interested in pattern. This is actually a IBM mainframe disk mounted on an aluminum sheet that was actually a radiator cover. So really sort of getting away from traditional materials, and also getting, we talk about the gaze and the eyes being the most important part of the icon. And I was really trying to figure out whether I could get away from that and still have the same kind of emotional power in the painting. I'm showing you here a 14th century example, and an example by my teacher, who is a really fine iconographer. And you'll see that it really compositionally doesn't deviate very much. And so one of the things that I grappled with early on was, how much of that can you let go of? How much should you let go of to make it real for you today? Because I think every artist wants to speak to their own generation. And there are a lot of clues that we were expected to learn studying iconography. For example, these red cloths hanging at the top of the painting signify that this was happening indoors, because in early Christian painting, we didn't paint interiors, we only painted exteriors. And the way you signified that it was an interior was this red thing hanging there. Well, that's great, but most people don't know that. I realized that even the people that go to church with me on Sunday couldn't read icons the way I could. And I thought, well, learning to paint these this way, if people aren't reading them this way, isn't necessarily very meaningful. So I kept pushing the envelope, and I would revisit traditional subject matter, but try and strip it down to the things that I felt that mattered, both the things that were exciting visually. In the Byzantine tradition, there's really a sense of rhythm, and color is really, really significant. So those were things that I explored. And these, I'm showing you two enunciations. This one is probably 15 years later. So really pictorially pushing in a different direction, relying more on pattern, relying more on color. And this is something that I continued to do and have, we weave back and forth. I've been painting for 25 years. So I'm going to show you, and I'm just going to skim through. You'll see that these are Madonnas, but I've reinterpreted them in a variety of different ways, working off traditional prototypes like a Hodegitria, but stripping out the faces, stripping out the eyes, and hopefully finding that they're still resonating in religious contexts. I have shown a lot in liturgical contexts in Presbyterian, Methodist, and Lutheran congregations, because they don't, unlike in our church, they don't have a history of visual depictions, so they're not as upset about breaking rules. So I've actually had a bunch of commissions in those kinds of environments. I've also obviously worked with angels. Now, some of these pieces are very traditional media, like here we have egg tempera and gold leaf, but an entirely contemporary depiction. The other influence that I think, if I talk about the two things that were really important to me, the iconography was, but there also was modernism. I just, I couldn't ignore, and that was probably the biggest challenge for me, is I couldn't paint icons and pretend that Picasso, Matisse, and all these wonderful things that came after them didn't happen. And how do you marry those two and make them relevant today? The Ukrainian avant-garde was especially interesting because they marry a lot of the folk imagery, and they also, in the there was a history in my family. We had Josip Pirnyak of Kurbas theater was my uncle, and so I had been exposed a lot to that kind of stuff, and there were integrating that flat use of color and shape, and again, talk about rhythm, how your eye moves up the page. This isn't an icon, and yet in terms of how it's built, it's very much the same way. When you start a traditional Byzantine icon, you actually create a series of flat shapes that it's almost like paper cut silhouettes. And a lot of the early modernist work has the same sorts of sensibilities. Archipenko, turning things into planar shapes and looking at negative space, really made me think about, changing the way the shapes are made and reinventing them. An absolute favorite, Sonia Delaunay, They spoke to a palette that I think is inherently Ukrainian. I've actually had people from Ukraine, and I've not had the fortune to go to Ukraine, but I've often had them comment on the fact that they think that my palette is inherently Ukrainian, which I find interesting because it's something that I've absorbed in the abstract. And you can't ignore the peasant influence. I mean, all of the, whether you talk about embroideries or pisanki, we've all of us at one time or another are inevitably taught to make pisanki. And I don't do it very often, but I definitely am mesmerized by the geometry and the color. My most recent project is currently on view at the Ukrainian Museum and is a series of paintings that were done on vinyl records, which were found at the beginning of the pandemic. And these started really as an accident, like many artists. And I think, we talk about culture. I was thinking about this cultural heritage and what we encounter. And though we are all quite comfortable, we grew up with parents and grandparents who lived through the war. And so there was a real sense of you don't throw things away. And so over the course of my life, I definitely collect things. And I think that's one of those epigenetic hangovers that you, or it's just sort of ingrained and imprinted on you because it might come in useful. In any case, I picked this collection up about a week before the pandemic started. And I really thought I was going to do something sculptural, but I just put them in the laundry room and then eventually in my studio, and I started painting. And ironically, they're hanging in the space in the Ukrainian Museum that is where they usually hang their pisanka exhibit. And my mother came in and said, "Chris, do they look like pisanka?" And indeed, because they're round, there's a relationship. And some of the motifs overlap. The early pieces that I started were actually specifically around the virus, because we were all sitting and looking at charts and graphs, and it was this sort of looming invisible thing. There was something really wonderful about these pieces being small. A record is something that's intimate. It has a relationship to your body. I'm old enough to remember having records as a kid. So there was just an interesting relationship to the whole thing. And they stacked nicely in my studio. So I would just pick them up and start working. As the series continued, I inevitably leaned on familiar themes, because a lot of my work is, I want my imagination to have a memory. I want to create work that speaks to where we are today, but at the same time acknowledges the past. And so there are these themes that weave through centuries of art, definitely weave through my paintings. So these themes that come back, and very often, Ukrainian folklore is very rich, and there is this whole magic fairy tale component. Things like Tvik Papurit, the fern flower, which is supposed to bloom at midnight and give you good luck. And a lot of these, as we get older and our lexicons get bigger, we realize that a lot of these stories are not specific to Ukraine. Behind me, I have a tree of life. A tree of life is an icon, but it's also found in our embroideries, and it's a very international or global symbol. It's something that every culture uses. And so you realize that these things, as much as they are Ukrainian, a lot of them speak to who we are as humans. In the icons come back. The one on the bottom is the patron saint for essential workers. That seemed like one of those things that was inevitable, I suppose, inventing your own for the current situation. And certainly the interest in pattern, here we see specific references to weaving. I also have references to embroidery, some of it more sort of Neo-Geo, and I sometimes will use actual embroideries as stencils. I also have a big collection that's going somewhere that I haven't figured out yet. It's one of those things that I started collecting, and it's hasn't been born yet. for the final piece, I'm going to leave you with the piece. It's actually not finished. I don't usually like to show work in progress, but it's far enough along that I think you get the sense of where it's going. But given the situation currently, I've decided to do a couple of new paintings. This is the Defender, and this is Saint Michael, patron saint of Kiev. So I hope that gives a little bit of a window, but I tried to keep it to specifics rather than it focusing on bodies of work. God help me, we'd be here for hours. But I thought I'd try and give you a sense of the specific influences that are cultural.
Well, thank you so much. I know I just learned quite a bit about your work. The circle, the piece on the records, that just seems so transformative. And then to see where you're going with the new work, it's nice to see these bright, colorful paintings in this moment. Again, we're going to open it up for questions and answers at the end, but I want to make sure everyone has a nice chance to speak. And one quick thing, I just love the diversity of the contemporary artists and the work on this panel. So we've had contemporary embroidery, we have had installation, contemporary installation, sound installation, and then some painting, right? Painting seems so traditional. And now we're going to go to photography. So Andrea, if you would go ahead and introduce yourself, and please pronounce your name properly for us as well.
I'll try. Hi, I'm Andrea Wenglowskyj. I'm an artist based in Buffalo, New York. And some context, and I want to say thank you, Charlotte, for having me. And it was really nice to connect with all of you in light of the awful tragedy happening, and connect in this idea of making and honoring Ukraine in this way. So first, how I fit into all this is I am kind of like Chrisa, first generation Ukrainian-American. My parents were born in Western Ukraine. My mom, they fled in 1944 as refugees. My father was sponsored to come over in the 50s, and they met at a Ukrainian dance in Washington, DC in college. So that's cute. And they raised us again in a really intense Ukrainian-American upbringing. We did Ukrainian dancing. We went to Saturday school every Saturday. I have, a degree from when I was in high school in Ukrainian studies. And this kind of was never an option for us. This is just what we did. We went to Ukrainian church, we ate Ukrainian food. My father was the MC at a really popular Ukrainian church festival we had in Rochester, New York. Everyone embroidered, and we attended Ukrainian scouting camp. And so this is where I'll start, more of my artist talk. I wanted to share a project, one of my projects that I feel like really kind of hits the nail on the head with depicting how the Ukrainian diaspora has fought to preserve culture, traditions, language that have been continuously tried to be taken away from them. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to let the photos go through while I talk about them, and then I'll go back and kind of talk about some specific ones. Give me one moment. Oops. All right, I'm going to play this. Can you all see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so it should hopefully just start going. So, this is a Ukrainian-American summer camp outside of Buffalo, New York. It's called Novi Sokil. And it's where I spent over 12 formative years and where my family sent generations of campers since the 1950s. So I started photographing here back in 2008 in graduate school and stopped for a while. And now that I live in Buffalo, close to it, I've been there more frequently. But I feel like I should provide some basic history for those who might not know about it. So over 65 years ago, Ukrainian Americans purchased this land in Western New York. It's now at over 40 acres. And the land was specifically there to host Ukrainian scouting camps and other activities by the organization called Plast. So Plast was officially formed in Ukraine, back in Lviv in Western Ukraine, around in 1912 is the history. And it was like a lot, it was kind of like Boy Scouts, like, but it was spurred by nationalistic activity. Young boys wanted to join PLAS to defend Ukraine against the Red Army. So then in 1918, we started the time, again, where there was decades of Russian and German occupation. So PLAS was banned, but it continued to operate underground illegally for decades. And then it kind of rose again in popularity after World War II, when my grandmother and my mother's generation came, to the United States and settled in diasporas. And actually during the time of when it was kind of like illegal and underground, its fundamental book, Life in Place, Życia w Plasti, was written, which outlines all of the laws, regulations, codes that are still followed to a T to this day. So eventually when, these permanent diasporas were established, PLAST was promoted as an active organization by having weekly meetings, still happening to this day in many cities with large Ukrainian populations, having summer camps. And it's like this perseverance of decade after decade, year after year, meeting after meeting, where I know that like the population of kids and young adults that attend ebb and flow. It's like, this, I like to call it like the anxiety of amnesia. Like no one wants to forget. Everyone wants to remember these traditions that were once banned in Ukraine. And that's like a guiding force of the Ukrainian-American community that I grew up in. So despite, all of these horrific attempts to cancel Ukrainian culture by Russia, these amazing stewards of this camp, and there are others across North America and, and Canada and other countries around the world. I feel like Novi Sokol is like this. I'll pause it here. Novi Sokol is like this. I guess it's going to keep going. I don't know how to stop it here. Uh-oh, I lost my mouse, Charlotte. Okay. Oh, here we go. I'm going to show. Do you guys see my screen still? Or no, you see me? Give me 1 second. I'll go back to it. You see my keynote?
Yes.
Okay. I feel as though, this parcel of land, this place is just like a constant reminder that Ukrainians won't stop celebrating their language and traditions. And I really like to think of this place also as like a theater set where the same play happens over and over again every single summer, with just a new cast of characters, where the land doesn't change. Everyone's speaking Ukrainian. The same traditions happen over and over again, and it's a kind of comfort, and it takes so much effort. And I feel like, PLAS Camp is a rite of passage for a lot of young Ukrainians in North America. And we can, if anyone has been to one of these camps or summer camp in general, which I think is a pretty American experience, we remember, how it smells when you get there, how not to trip on the tree roots in the dark when you're walking to and from your tents, the panic of when the homesickness sets in when you're super young, and how terrible it was to jump into that cold pool in the morning, and the excitement of having bonfires, and the itchiness and the discomfort of the summer of your uniforms, when you're learning how to do military marching and drills in the hot sun. I mean, anyone who's been to one of these camps could probably go on forever and ever about all of these experiences that we all share. An artist I was talking to, Maya Hayuk, about this project earlier today, I'm going to quote her. She just said, she's been talking a lot about going to PLAS camp. And she's like, it's where I had my first kiss and my first dose of punk rock. But the underlying principle was that we'd have to reclaim Ukraine from the Russians at some point in our lives. So do it through whatever strategy necessary. So there is like this very precarious undertone to why this camp exists. And I'm often asked about this work, why no one's having any fun in my photos, because it is summer camp and I can promise that they are. They're happy kids really having these really formative experiences. But I think that maintaining this culture year after year is like really serious business. And I've looked to a lot of archival images from Ukraine to like present day. And the seriousness is always portrayed in, you know, group photos and just by being part of this organization, it just feels like there's something very important to withhold, or excuse me, uphold. Now that you guys have some background of why I wanted to start photographing here, I wanted to kind of go through a few photos and just kind of guide you through why I took some of them, or also translate some of them. So this one here is a really big ass sign. I would say it's probably around 5 feet tall. And it says, here we speak the Ukrainian language. And I have this sign in many different photos from throughout the years. And it is repainted and made to look fresh quite often. This is actually an image of the main bathroom, where there are, a girl and boys side, typical kind of camping showers and bathroom, but I've always appreciated the architecture and that of the cabins, because to me, they also mimic traditional Ukrainian Ukrainian village homes. It looks very similar to the house that my mom was born in Western Ukraine. And as I begin to start thinking about my daughter, who's 7, who's eligible to, start going to camp and attending PLOS meetings on a weekly basis. COVID kind of took a little bit of time away from us for that. Her hands holding all of our old badges, gets me to think about, what that means for future generations. And so that will be part of my exploration as this project continues. The other image I wanted to talk about was this mailbox, which has been there since I can remember. And I feel like when you're in the nucleus of the camp, of the Tabir, it was always like this lifeline to the outside world. And now as a grown-up, I think about the mail carrier, like driving in and just being, kind of like this outsider. And it's just kind of just a really fascinating enclave. And the other image I wanted to also explain is this one, which is a collection of just archival things that, my family has saved. One of our scarves, that book that I mentioned earlier, Życia Plasty, Life and Plus, which was written, 100 years ago or more, that outlines, how to live as a Plastun, as someone who is part of Plast. In those brown socks you see all the kids wearing, we still have ours. I don't know, my mom saved them for us. And the last one I wanted to share, which I think, and this actually is an image of me earning something as an older camper. And this last image, I have a lot of these as well, as this called Tochkuvnya. It is like a public rating system on how each camper, whether you're like one of the younger kids or one of the older campers, how you are doing on a daily basis with how you present yourself, and your language skills, your behavior towards others, things like that. So I feel like that is a very specifically Plast and Ukrainian-American part of Plast that has just not changed over the generations. So, and yeah, I hope that over this project, as it continues over the years, with like a more personal introspection, and I can travel to other camps in North America and Ukraine, is the next portion of this. I'll stop sharing my screen now. And I think that's all I have to say about that.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I did not know about the camp Plast. I didn't know about that until I was introduced to your work. So that's always very interesting for me. I'd like to open this up to have a little conversation in a minute. So start thinking about your questions, but I have a few things I'd like to just kind of speak about a little bit first. I'm going to start actually with Luba. Luba, your work was so intense, like with the shadows and the geometry of the architecture. And when I really saw the videos and you speaking about it, it really helped me understand it a bit more. Interesting side point, we just took down an exhibition called Shadows here at Pelham Art Center, which I was like, oh, her work would have fit right in. But the intensity of like those steel plates or like that harshness, and like, I'm wondering, is there anything that relates to like kind of that you see in your work that relates to your experience of coming to the US? And do oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm not certain. I think I am more inspired by how things, how human condition is reflected in architecture, so to say. So the way we think is the way we build. So that's how I see it. I guess I'm not sure if me coming to United States really, I'm sure it did. I don't know how. That's what I can say. I started as a 3D animator. Since I was very little, I wanted to make immersive worlds, kind of magical places. But I don't know why. Maybe I lived in, I don't know. It's possible. I lived in a communal apartment. I don't know if you know about those in USSR, where you share apartment with strangers. So kind of having like a world to escape is possible. I used to hide inside a piano, like with the stand-up piano. Like when I was little, I could hide. I would like hide a lot, so like I would hide inside a piano. So maybe I'm creating these large pianos to hide. That's just speculation that my work is personal but abstracted in a way. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah,
That's all right. It's not a test or anything. Yeah, that's sorry. It's just, I guess it was something I thought of course, obviously with like how dangerous Ukraine is right now, and like seeing that huge steel piece like bending. I'm like, this is, some heavy duty, scary materials, like this balancing act, and kind of, I guess also like I read into things a lot.
I'm working, I actually am like installing a piece, like I'm in the gallery where I'm installing a piece right now where things are suspended, and maybe I can, I don't know if you can see it, but basically things are propped into the ceiling and suspended, and the piano string just hold them up kind of. So they're hanging, and I was thinking about what's happening in Ukraine and the danger of the sky, because you don't know when things are coming, and there's a precarity in that. Yeah.
Yeah, very. I just had one other quick question: is what year did you come to the US?
I came in 97.
97. Just my own curiosity, but thank you.
Yeah,
for that.
sure.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you. There was something just about those like elements of danger. And Andrea, is that right? Andrea, when I first saw those photographs, I was like, oh my God, all these young children at their summer camp, like they do seem so sad. So I'm so happy you talked about that. So I was like, I hope they're not having a bad time at camp. But to hear, I'm really happy that you addressed that in that conversation. And again, like I didn't know that was a thing. So it was very good for me to learn about as well. And do you think that those camps like will continue on? I believe the nearest ones, there's some in the Catskills, kind of close to where we are in Westchester right now. What's your opinion on that?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think that there's always kind of like dips and highs with attendees. But I think that it's still going strong in Western New York. I'm not too up on the other camps, but yeah, I think that, this I mean, people like I'm of the generation where now my kids are eligible to go. So I did have 1 year where I got to attend for a week when my daughter was 4. And I was there with my old camp friends for a week and all of our small children. And it was amazing, right? Because we could kind of share our love for the place and love of the Ukrainian language and songs in a very kind of like, in a very innocent way with these young children. But then as I saw the teens and everyone and kind of these people who really, again, these stewards of PLOS, the people who are taking it seriously, they are becoming leaders for the younger kids. They're tough. They're really making it, they're really holding on. And I have to say too, which is a total sidebar, but when I was in Ukraine, I was in the town, the biggest town near where my mother was born, in Berezhana, which there was a big university there. And I went, to the local history museum, and there was a dark room. The lady came and turned on the lights for me. I was the only one in there. And there was a notable people from the West who have immigrated board of photos. And one of them was my aunt, which was astonishing to see her face. Like, it was this beautiful photograph of her on this board. So I knew I was in the right place. My great aunt. And then, but the second person was this man called Brachik Slavko. Slavko, he was like basically in charge of Sokil for, it seems like 100 years. He's since passed away, but he had his photo with, there was a whole write-up with him from there. And he was also from that area of Ukraine, which I didn't know, but it just proves that, the work that the PLOS has done over, all these generations, like really, it's notable.
And if do you have to know Ukrainian?
Yes.
You have to speak Ukrainian. Your kids got to speak Ukrainian to go there, right?
Yes.
You
And
do.
I'm going to chime in just
Please
as
do.
as a devil's advocate. I went to those camps. I went to PLOS primarily in the Catskills at East Chatham and Vojtrupa. And I have kids. My daughter goes. My son chooses not to. I am married to an American. We do not speak Ukrainian at home. My daughter has a tutor and has been learning the language. And there are factions now. I think that the work that they do to preserve all this is phenomenal. I think the one thing that's really interesting, and I think I've talked to a lot of my friends recently in the last month about this. Those of us who grew up as when we were growing up, not having a choice about going to Ukrainian school, not having a choice about preserving culture was very much part of the fabric of how our community functioned. But that was because at that time, when I was a small child, Ukraine as a country did not exist. It was part of the fabric of the Soviet Union. And my grandparents said, you have to speak the language, because if we don't speak this language, it's going to disappear. And so there was a sense that we had a burden to carry, that we had to preserve this beautiful thing because it wasn't going to exist if it wasn't for us. And one of the things that I have to say has been the most heartening and the most beautiful about the last 30 years that Ukraine has really fought for its freedom is now to hear them, Zelensky and the rest of them, saying there will always be a Ukraine, because our identity is that strong. And I think we are actually coming to an interesting moment where our diasporan community, and it's going to be rejuvenated because we've got lots of new Ukrainians coming. So maybe that's good. And maybe that'll help these organizations survive. But I have to say that as an American, and I am an American, we have to find a way to preserve the richness and the beauty, but recognize that they can't do the same things that they did when I was a little girl and I spoke Ukrainian before I spoke English. My kids speak, they don't speak as well as I do. And I don't think that I personally think that we need to be a little bit more inclusive and to realize that it's not just about preserving language. I think that there was in the beginning, we were hell-bent about all that. I'm not sure that and I don't want to go off into politics, but I think that it raises some interesting things. And I marvel that on this panel, there are 3 of us here that really talked about this sense of needing to preserve and really having grown up with this sense that was part of our duty, as it were, and I guess I did definitely feel all of that. I also felt like, as hard as it was to have a foot in both worlds, I had like all this extra stuff, all this great icing that was enriching my experience. And I'm grateful for that.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. So at the beginning of this, I shared that my husband was Ukrainian. He came here right after the fall of the Soviet Union. And this is interesting, we're speaking about language, because when he was in school, they had to speak Russian, but then at home he was speaking Ukrainian, and then coming over here as a young, well, I guess as an 11-year-old, you've got this 11-year-old vocabulary that's a mixture of Russian and Ukrainian. So it's so interesting for me to hear about these preservations of culture and the language and through those camps and whatnot. And now he's very consciously working on his Ukrainian. But also my first trip to Ukraine in 2010, where I came kind of as the new bride, the American bride touring to Bela Tserkva. And it was a very interesting experience for me. I don't speak Russian, I don't speak Ukrainian. The only person who spoke English was my now husband, who had to really translate for me. And that was just, it was just so interesting to see that. And we happened to be there in August for the anniversary of the independence of Ukraine, and saw speakers get up on stage. And even though I didn't speak the language, kind of could see heckling happen because one of the officials was speaking Russian at the Ukrainian cultural celebration. And this was back in 2010. So it was just, it's very interesting. And I think a lot of what I wanted to do with these programs, speaking with Ukrainian-American artists, what we're doing tomorrow about, Ukrainian heritage and arts, is like this concept of like that it's not going to go away. It doesn't go away, and that it continues on in whatever tradition, but that knowledge is so important. So I really love that you brought that up as a point. Would any of our artists like to add something about anything at all, or work? What other things are going on with them? We've got about 10 minutes left to continue.
I would like to share information about the arts fundraiser that we have going on Artsy. This is one of the initiatives that I started when the war broke out. Simultaneously, I started a group that we've named Ukrainian Artists and Allies League. And a lot of the artists that wanted to find this Ukrainian community that weren't necessarily belong to Plast or Sum here, or weren't religious. And as an artist, I found that a Ukrainian artist, I've wanted community myself that's connected to it. And so a lot of us, especially on this panel today, have sort of joined this group, and they help put on the sale. So the sale is, it's live now, it's on Artsy, it ends April 14th. It has 120 plus artworks. Almost half of those are by contemporary Ukrainian artists. And so we are raising funds for Ukrainian refugees. We've picked out, we're working in conjunction with the Ukrainian Institute of Modern Art in Chicago. Those artists that we have contracted through the museum, we will be donating our proceeds to 4 different nonprofits that directly help Ukraine, and that's Razom, Insight NGO, which focuses on the LGBTQ community within Ukraine, Fight for Right, which focuses on Ukrainians with disabilities, and the Ukrainian Emergency Art Fund that focuses on direct artist support. So we were really looking for how can we directly help Ukraine with nonprofits that have good reputations for efficiency, but also to help sort of groups that tend to fall within the margins of refugee help and this sort of area. So what's really great, not only are we raising funds, but by including so many contemporary Ukrainian artists, this really becomes about cultural awareness too. And that is such a radical act right now, as Putin is trying to sort of destroy Ukraine and its culture and assimilate it into Russia. So I do also see it as a political act to have a show that focuses on Ukrainian artists. There's a lot of art fundraisers right now, but they don't have that element to it. It's usually mostly people who are just allies. And so, yeah, please check it out. I'm going to include it in the chat of how you can go ahead and look. Krista and I both have lots within it. And yeah, please share it on social media. We're trying to get as many eyeballs on it and hopefully bids as well.
Great, thank you so much. That is such a noble effort. Luba, go ahead.
I just realized that the show I'm installing is a show of Ukrainian artists, and I should share info about it. So I'm just so out of it. I'll share. It's called it's a Cindy Record Gallery. There's no official opening, but because they didn't want to celebrate. But this is the link. There's going to be a few artists. 3 artists. It's in New York on Orchard Street in Rivington. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm so happy you mentioned Orchard Street because there was another show I was going to go check out. So now I could go check them both out. Now I feel like now we've talked, so I love that. Would anyone else like to any of our artists would like to share anything about your current projects, things you have coming up? Okay. Oh, sorry. I mean, obviously you just shared a whole lot of information about your life and your work, and you all spoke beautifully. So thank you so much for that. I see we've had a pretty active chat of some really, I'm seeing a lot of compliments happening, but but if anyone would like to go ahead and unmute from our audience and ask your question, I'm actually seeing there are a few. I'm going to see if I could. Okay, great. All right, I'm just doing a quick scan there. It seems like it's mostly complimentary comments and people sharing some news. This was really great, everybody. I can't thank you enough for taking your time. I know this is an extremely difficult time, but it's a conversation worth having, and I'm so happy that I got to meet each one of you and be inspired. And this is one of the ways that Pelham Art Center is doing some things to support Ukrainian artists right now and Ukrainian heritage. So tomorrow at Pelham Art Center, we have Sofika coming to demonstrate and lecture on Pisanki, which is much more traditional, and the symbolism and the folklore. I tried it as a kid and I'm gonna learn a whole lot. And please join us Sunday. We have a big free cultural event happening with some traditional Ukrainian singing and dancing and music and craft demonstrations. It's a little spring festival. We'll be raising money for the relief efforts as well next on Sunday. Busy day at the Pelham Art Center. Outside of those, we also have an art opening here on Thursday and an African dancing group on Saturday as well. It's all on our website, it's on our social media, and you have been fantastic. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Charlotte. Thank you so much. Bye, guys.
Okay, thank you. Have a good night.